Hello, and welcome to this third in a series of webinars looking at JBoss EAP 6. My name's Andy Overton. I work as a Senior Managed Services Consultant at C2B2. Previous webinars in this series, we've looked at an introduction to setting up and configuring JBoss EAP 6, setting up a cluster and load balancing using mod cluster. And in the previous one, we looked at some of the core differences between EAP 5 and 6. Those are available on our YouTube channel, and we also have a blog where I've put more detail in there. I'll give you details of that at the end. But today we're going to be looking at migrating from EAP 5 to EAP 6. This is only a short webinar, so I'm not going to be able to cover everything, but I'm going to give you an overview of some of the major things to consider. Okay, so what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at planning your migration, the startup and configuration of your servers, some of the changes within clustering. We take a look at the new modular approach to class loading, the changes to JNDI Lookups, how to set up data sources and resource adapters, the change to Hornet Queue for JMS, and finally testing to ensure everything works as expected. So first of all, planning. Now, don't underestimate the importance of planning. Every application is different, and every migration will be different. You want to be taking advantage of new capabilities in EAP 6. You also want to be looking at improving the way you manage your applications, refactoring your code, things like that. But all of these changes need to take place in an ordered environment, and you need a step-by-step plan on how you're going to go about doing that. And you need to plan your migration as a complete project. So as part of the migration planning, you need to look at information gathering, gather as much information as possible. You need to understand the system that you're trying to migrate, understand its complexity, work out any migration issues, and work out also what skills you're going to need in order to accomplish the migration. You need to take time out to understand what's changed between EAP 5 and EAP 6. 6 is a major overhaul of 5. There's a vast amount of difference between the two. You need to analyze and understand your applications. Each application is going to be unique. You need to thoroughly understand the components and your architecture before you attempt any migration. And finally, make sure that you document everything and that everything's under configuration control and backed up. This will allow you to revert changes if necessary, and also to keep track of what works and what doesn't, and to be able to roll back if you find issues. Now, a common mistake is to assume that the old environment should be replicated on the new platform. This is not necessarily true. You need to be looking at the best way of moving from one to the other. Is it best to take your code as it is and only make the changes necessary for migration, or is now a good time to look at rewriting some of that code? Conduct reviews. Well, conduct several rounds of reviews. For example, you could start off with a review of the application or the applications that you're looking to migrate and determine which ones you actually need to migrate. There's a good opportunity here for pruning. There may be services that you no longer need, no longer use, or there may be opportunities to improve those services. And create a detailed migration plan. Plan with attention to detail and document what it is you do and what you're intending to do. Migration is not a simple job, but if you plan everything, then you'll have a much better chance of success. So, startup and configuration. Well, all the startup scripts have now changed. EAP 5 used a profile-based deployment configuration. You had a bunch of files, a bunch of directories, which contain multiple configuration files for things like databases, resource adapters, security. Now in EAP6, all your deployment configuration is done using one file. This file is used to configure all the services and all the subsystems used for deployment. You need to decide whether you want to look at using standalone mode or domain mode, as we discussed in the last webinar. This is a new thing in EAP6. You need to ensure you understand both and then choose according to what your particular needs are, and understand the implications on your applications if you switch to domain mode. All configuration used to be done in multiple files, whereas now if you're using standalone or domain mode, either one, you have one particular configuration file. You have a standalone.xml file or a domain.xml file, and all the information that was previously contained in multiple configuration files needs to be migrated into this single configuration file. So in order to enable clustering in EAP5, you needed to start your servers using the all profile. And this is basically a command line. On the command line you could pass an argument to say which profile you wanted to use. Now in EAP6, the method of enabling clustering depends on whether your servers are started using the domain controller or the standalone servers. But basically, if you're in standalone mode, you need to use the high availability configuration, so the standalone ha.xml or the standalone full ha.xml. And if you're running in domain mode, then use the HA profile or the HA sockets socket binding group. Now, things like your bind address, JVM root, multicast port address, and the protocol stack are all now contained in the one configuration file, whereas before they were scattered about amongst various different configuration files. You also need to take into account, if you're planning to migrate client applications, you need to be aware that the client jar has now changed. Rather than using the JBoss all-client.jar, you'll now be using JBoss client.jar. Okay, now class loading. There's been a big change in class loading from EAP5. You need to take time out to understand these changes, because this will definitely come up when you look at migrating. There's a new module approach. Class loading is basically based on modules, and you have to define explicit dependencies on other modules, and deployments are also modules in EAP6. And you don't have access to classes that are defined in jars unless you put in an explicit dependency on those classes. There's a XML file which you can use to control your class loading. It's called JBoss deployment structure.xml. This is a JBoss specific deployment descriptor, and this allows you to control your class loading in a fine-grained manner. Now you may need to change the packaging structure of your applications. Basically, when you migrate, you may have to change the structure of your ERL WAR files due to the class loading changes. Okay, in EAP5 you control the order of the deployments within an if through the use of the JBoss app.xml. This is no longer the case. The new EAC6 spec provides an initializing order element in the application.xml. And this allows you to control the order in which the modules within an EA are deployed. And you also may find that you need to remove the class loading element from JBoss web.xml if you've used that. Basically, the way that works is now the default class loading behavior in AP6, so it's no longer necessary. So if you've got a class loading element within your JBoss web.xml, then that just needs to be removed. Another change is properties files. In EAP5, you had the server server name /conf was available on the class path, so you could basically put properties files in there, and they were available on the class path of your application. This is now changed. To get those properties onto the class path, you need to package them within your application. So for example, if you're deploying a .war file, then you need to put those properties into the webin/classes. And similarly, if you're packaging an EA file and you need properties available, then you need to package those within a jar file and then place that jar file in the lib directory of your EA. Okay, another thing that's changed is JNDI lookups. In EJP 3.1, there's a global JNDI namespace that was introduced and a series of related namespaces. These map to the various scopes of a Java application or an enterprise application. So you've got Java Global, you've got Java Module, and you've got Java App. So if you use JNDI lookups in your application, then you'll need to change those to follow this new namespace convention. So here's an example of a JNDI lookup in EAP5. So you basically get your initial context, and then you do a lookup for your particular EJB that you're looking for. Now in EAP6, the lookup name now uses this new portable Java App JNDI namespace. And if you want to do a stateful bean, you basically just add stateful on the end. So although it's quite a simple change, if you use JNDI lookups extensively, there could be a lot of changes, and although it's not particularly difficult to do, it is prone to error, so you need to keep an eye out for that. Okay, on to data sources and resource adapters. In EAP5, data source config was done in a file ending in -ds.xml, and then you deployed that into the server's deploy directory. And the JDBC driver was copied to the server lib directory or packaged in the application's webinf lib directory. Now in EAP6 this has changed. Basically you no longer package the JDBC driver with the application or in the server lib directory. Depending on the type of driver, if it's JDBC4 compliant, then the driver is specified within a file in the jar file. Otherwise, basically, you specify your driver class in your data source config. Now, your data source configs and your resource adapters are now defined in this individual config file. So rather than having them scattered about, as in EAP5, they're all contained in one particular configuration file, which depending on what mode you're in. So if you're in domain mode, it'll be in domain.xml. If you're in standalone mode, it'll be in standalone.xml. Okay, so the big change in JMS is that JBoss messaging has now been replaced with Hornet Queue. So if any of your applications use JBoss messaging as the messaging provider, then you'll need to make changes to your application in order to use Hornet Queue. You need to look at backing up your JBoss messaging data. This is all stored in a database, so you basically need to back up those particular tables. You need to transfer your existing JBoss messaging config to the EAP6 config files. And you may need to modify your application code as well. That depends. If you're using standard JMS, then you shouldn't need any changes. But if you connect into a cluster, then you'll need to look at the Hornet Queue documentation on how you do that, because it's done very differently than it is in JBoss messaging. And also you need to look at if your application code uses features that are specific to JBoss messaging, then you need to modify your code to use the equivalent features in Hornet Queue if they're available. If not, you'll have to work out a different way of doing it. And you also need to look at migrating the existing messages from the JBoss messaging database into Hornet Queue. Okay, so finally I want to talk about testing. Now, don't underestimate the importance of testing. As in when doing a development project, testing is one of the most important activities in the project. It's often overlooked. You need to ensure you've got sufficient time for testing and ensure that you've covered everything that needs to be tested. And migration is basically not finished until your new server or your new server site accomplishes all of your test cases. So this means you need to migrate your test cases and account for that in your plan. As you test your new migration or your new application on the new site, you might need to go back to previous steps due to errors you found during or after migration and fix them. So you also need to ensure that you've assigned enough time not only to do your testing, but also to test again if anything goes wrong. You need to look at functional testing. So you want to test all the functionality of the system and ensure it works as expected. You need to look at integration testing and ensure that all the parts work together. So your functional testing is looking at your basic individual services or functions, and then your integration testing, you're looking at putting all those together. And you also need to pay particular attention to performance and stress testing. You need to ensure that you can meet your customer's requirements and any SLAs that are in place. And you also may require new tests in order to test new functionality or anything where you've utilized EAP6 specific functionality. But basically, you need to ensure that there's time in place for doing testing and there's time for regression testing. And that you've planned your testing into your overall plan. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope it's been useful. As I mentioned earlier, we have a YouTube channel where this video and many others will be available. And we also have a blog where we regularly post on similar subjects and where this and other webinars in this series will be written up as blogs as well. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.